I'm joined now by David Mortimer. He'll be well known to many of you as a leading figure in several consensus statements and opinion pieces. He was for many years scientific director of Sydney IVF, and he's now based in Vancouver in Canada. David was one of 4 core participants in a consensus meeting on what they call future-proofing the IVF lab. And I shall ask him in a moment what exactly is meant by that. But I think what we all have in mind is ensuring that the lab can minimize the damage that might be done by any kind of emergency. I think in the back of their minds at the time was the COVID pandemic and how many clinics, I'm sure, were ill prepared for dealing with that. But David, can I first ask you, what exactly do you mean by future-proofing the IVF lab?
Hi, Sam. It's good to be here. Future-proofing is pretty much what you described. It's just being prepared to deal with whatever might come up. Obviously, we can't predict everything. We've got emergency preparedness plans in place for the things that we might anticipate, at least we should have. But there are things that catch you by surprise, and COVID was one of those examples. And that's exactly why we did put this consensus meeting together. We've done several Cairo consensuses before, and they've been around the laboratory systems, the air quality, that sort of thing.
Yes.
And this one, I came up with the idea because when I was looking at the papers being published by different groups around the world, as describing how they had accommodated the issues of coping with COVID into their laboratory practices, it was fairly obvious that quite a few of those things that they'd had to develop from scratch should have been in place already if they had gone through a formal accreditation process. Or even if they'd just followed the general principles of accreditation, they would have actually been anticipating a lot of these sorts of scenarios and would have actually found it much, much easier to adapt to the circumstances that we all experienced during COVID and lockdowns. So it's really a question of trying to promote the value of accreditation, whether it's a formal process of accreditation by an appropriate body or whether it's just following the principles of accreditation to organize how you might structure the management systems, your lab, your emergency preparedness, and how you might be anticipating things happening. None of us ever thought about closing labs down and then reopening them fairly soon afterwards. And deciding what to do. At the time, there was no guidance, and that's one thing that perhaps we might not have thought about. But then we've covered that, but several other scenarios that would really affect how easy it is to accommodate the circumstances of something like the COVID pandemic or whatever the next it might be.
Now, the organizer of this consensus meeting, it was mainly the alpha scientists in reproductive medicine. And how many opinions did you seek to develop this statement?
Well, this is like the other Cairo consensus meetings, which are actually supported and funded by the UEA's conference organization, and Dr. Mohammed Fauzi is the key person there. We're partnering for this consensus meeting and the imminent meetings we're planning for the next couple of years. We hope with Alpha again, because it's a great partnership. And while UEA's might be a Middle East meeting, it's the largest embryology meeting in the Middle East, and it has a very high profile, and it has the wherewithal to be able to support these consensus meetings. So we are grateful to UEA's for that support, and we hope that our partnership will continue.
Now, it's quite clear from reading the paper, which has just been published in RBM Online, that you believe that accreditation will solve a lot of the problems that you think exist in facing these emergencies. Why would a lab's accreditation to a national scheme or an international scheme, why do you think it would help in facing these emergencies?
Accreditation is focused really on establishing fitness for purpose of everything that you have, everything you do, how you do everything, And it's a question about looking at your systems and making sure that they are properly fit for purpose. So using a technique called failure modes and effects analysis, you can look at any thing you're doing, any process, any system, any practice, and look at what it's supposed to do, what its purpose is, what its goals are, look at how well it's achieving them, and then you can refine it and extend its capabilities. Now, if you're looking at accreditation, accreditation has many guises, but it is a general principle, and it's a peer-driven process, so it's not a regulatory process. It's usually completely voluntary, although some places do integrate it with licensing, like in the UK. But it's about following those philosophies. And if you have adopted those philosophies, as I say, whether it's via a formal accreditation process by one of the organizations that does do accreditation of IVF labs, or if it's just that you're following those principles, you will do the same things. You'll take the same approaches, you'll have the same philosophy, and you will look at how you do everything. And I've audited many, many labs over the last 25 years, and a lot of them are excellent, but there's a lot of them, and especially perhaps in the less affluent parts of the world, where a lot of things are not focused upon because they haven't got the time, it seems expensive, and accreditation is one of the things that can be quite expensive. If you look at everything that you're doing and how you're organizing it, then you will be able to anticipate more. You'll understand the weakness of your systems. You'll be able to repair those weaknesses. You'll be able to create extra resilience in your systems. And that's what accreditation is all about. And that's where proofing comes in.
But you do say in the report that many labs that you have seen and been there are ill-equipped to properly deal with these, what shall I call them, catastrophic eventualities.
Yes, I say it is true that in many places, labs are run on shoestring budgets. They have, many are understaffed already because there's a world shortage of embryologists, and training is quite available, but some places it takes longer than it really needs to. Other places, perhaps some organizations don't want to pay for trainees because they will risk them going away somewhere else and working there and losing their investment in training. Whether you want to talk about being a good corporate citizen is another matter, but the point is that everyone's looking for embryologists. So we're short-staffed, and that means if you focus on your developing systems that are efficient and effective, you can actually achieve more with the limited resources you've got. But in many situations, as I say, perhaps in the less affluent parts of the world, but also surprisingly in some of the richest parts of the world where things are being run very much on a shoestring to maximize profits, then you have situations where there's just not enough people to do all the stuff that needs to be done. They're already working on a system of stress. And if you put another stressor into the system, like dealing with a pandemic, they can't cope. And the quality of care is at great risk. So it's really about doing the best you can with what you've got, but at the same time identifying what you need and then start agitating to try and get that. And that's the job of lab directors and scientific directors to
and now in addition to this, David, you also make 3 what I might call practical responsibilities that labs might have. I've listed them here, that the first is to protect staff and patients. The second, to protect frozen tissues, cells, gametes in storage. And third, to secure, what shall I call them, the documents, patient information, financial information, and so on. I wonder if you might very briefly just run through each of these in terms of responsibility and what might practically be done.
So for staff and patients, we've got to be aware that, first of all, everybody follows universal precautions, and that means that we assume every specimen that we get into the lab is potentially infectious. Whether it is or not, we should be treating it that way, and that's what we need to look at. And that's part of protecting your staff. Protecting your patients is about making sure there's no cross-contaminations. And this all starts with the environment of the lab and then the techniques we use and the practices that we have. The aspects, particularly in terms of emergencies, is that how do you manage staff interests? You can't assume your staff are going to work 24/7. You've got to be careful about burnout. IVF is a very high risk profession because a small mistake can have devastating consequences. So we've got to be careful not to overtire the staff and support them as best you can. And when it comes down to working in a pandemic where they've all got restrictions on what's happening at home, just their own lives, and getting to and from work can be very difficult, as it was in some places. So you've got to think about all those things when you're trying to work out your staffing rosters and how many staff you need to have. Because if you say, oh, we can always get some more staff, well, that's total fallacy, because there's no more staff to be had and everyone's going to be looking for them at the same time. So you've got to have adequate resource to cope with almost the worst scenario you can think of. So that's how we look at the staff and the patients. The cryopreserved specimens, absolutely, we've got to know that we have an adequate supply of liquid nitrogen to make sure that those specimens in cryo storage are secure. And storage in liquid is very safe because the tanks have got a static holding time of weeks. So you can go for weeks without putting liquid nitrogen and not risk the specimens. Vapor storage has a shorter security time, so people need to do a formal risk analysis to decide which methodology they're going to use. But you might want to say that if you're in an area where liquid nitrogen supplies could be very much threatened, then you have to perhaps consider, do we want to install a liquid nitrogen generator of our own to give us that extra security? And I know places have done that. In India, for example, during the pandemic, it was almost impossible to get compressed gases because the government had all the gas companies manufacturing oxygen, supplying oxygen to hospitals because of all the people who were hospitalized with COVID. So and we couldn't have anticipated that. So we can now. So you need to think about how are you going to set up your modified systems to future-proof, to be able to cope with these potential or likely shortages. Supply chain issues are massive. I have never been a fan of just-in-time supply chains because I know that it relies on a lot of systems that are, if they're all running at their limits, it doesn't take much for that system to break down. And we can't survive on just in time in an IVF lab, because if you've got patients under treatment and you don't get a critical product, you can't do the treatments. And if there's a shortage supply of everywhere, you're not going to find backup products either. So you need to make sure you have adequate stocks in-house as far as you can for every product that you can and have a long enough shelf life. So you need to just look at your systems, look at what you do, and make sure that you're giving yourself that practicality. Records, the records are safe under all expectations of physical medical records and electronic medical records. But at the same time, if you're relying on a paper system, what would happen if, unlike COVID, the infectious organism was transmitted via surfaces? Everybody who's handling paper records is potentially leaving behind fomites on those medical records that could infect somebody else. So electronic medical records really are the way to go for the future, because those you don't risk transmitting the organism. If we all talk about bugs in computer systems, but we don't talk about bugs on paper records, it's a very different situation. I hope that people will look at going to electronic medical records and not sticking with paper, which has always been a problem because the amount of paper in labs all contributes particulates and fibers that block up the filters that give us our air quality.
And the report, David, is saying that all these practical responsibilities, the potential solutions, they should all be tied together in a, what shall I call it, an emergency plan, if you like, and it should be there in place. All staff should be familiar with it, and it should set the possibilities, the practicality should be set out quite clearly. Now, David, my last question, what sort of emergencies are we talking about? You've talked about COVID. I've heard or have read a small piece about having to move many embryos in storage in Ukraine from from heavily threatened hospitals to more safer locations.
I mean, you can anticipate war. It depends on where you are as to what precautions you might take. Some parts of the world are at greater risk of armed conflicts than others. I hope we're not in the same risk as other places. You may not anticipate someone invading your country. It depends on the size of the country. But, I mean, Ukraine's a large country, but it's a very heavy focused attacks that they're suffering. So the ability to move those tanks is an important thing. But if you're a larger cryobank, your tanks are going to be much larger and not amenable for movement. They are going to be too big and too heavy that will need low loaders, cranes, whatever, even if you can even get them out of the building. So there are risks, and some of those risks would need to be managed via consent forms that acknowledge that the clinic can't be held responsible for the results of acts of war. One of our things we use in our risk management lectures is about saying it is quite possible. We almost got hit by was it a comet or meteor just yesterday or the day before?
Yes.
One just suddenly was found and missed. If one of those hits us, we can all forget about it. None of it matters. We can't do anything about that. So that's a risk. It's catastrophic and totally, as it seems, unpredictable, and there's nothing to do to protect against it. So you live with some risks. But you need to sit and be imaginative and think about them. Talk to people who've gone through a lot of these things. There's one guy who's involved in the consensus, Charles Borman, has gone through a number of different types of emergencies in the clinics he's been working with over the years. And he gives the most fantastic lectures because he's had a lot of experience and had to deal with a lot of issues relating to nearby shootings, bombs, floods. Fires, but internal floods. I mean, you might think it's all nice and safe inside your building, but you can get a flood from the floor above, and we've had those things happen because the plumbing fails at the floor above, and your lab gets deluged. I mean, there's one place that I know this is where Charles works. Twice they had floods from above inside the building, and you've got to know what to do with how to manage those. And those are the sorts of recommendations are available in the literature, and people need to be aware of these things and think about them. Whenever we're helping people design new labs, we talk about these risks from above. Are they going to take any precautions against them? And I can think of one example where the architect said, "Don't be silly, that sort of thing never happens." And it's happened to them twice before they even got the clinic open.
Yes.
And one was actually toilets.
I guess it's a reminder of the old adage that one should plan for the worst and hope for the best. And but nevertheless, David, thank you very much. I mean, it's everyone hopes, of course, that these disasters, catastrophes don't happen, but as you say, they do. And it is obviously better to be prepared in a properly systematic way. So thank you very much for joining us. And
welcome,
I'm sure there'll be many reading the paper in RBM Online.
We hope so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.